Welcome to this episode of the All Things Marilyn Podcast. My name is Scott Fortner, Marilyn Monroe historian, collector, and owner of the Marilyn Monroe Collection.
And I'm Elisa Jordan. I'm an author, founder of LA Woman Tours, and I am also a Marilyn Monroe historian.
Elisa, we're back for Season 3, Episode 2. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited about this episode, too. It's really interesting.
We've been trying to get David on for a while. The topic that we're going to be discussing today is something that he just recently released, and that is the real story of how Marilyn's mother, Gladys, came up with the name Norma Jeane.
It's one of those topics where I don't think anyone has given it a lot of thought, but in true David Stenn form, he saw something that no one else had really taken, and he ran with it, and he uncovered a big story, and that's what he does. That's what he's famous for.
For our viewers who might not be familiar with David Stenn, he's an American television writer, producer, biographer, and film preservationist. His television credits include Untold Hollywood, Boardwalk Empire, Girl 27, The L Word, 21 Jump Street, Hill Street Blues, and Beverly Hills 90210. He's known for his biographies of Hollywood stars Clara and Jean Harlow, and he's also a huge fan of Marilyn. I think that we put David in the same category as April Vivier, like a dog with a bone.
Easily, yeah.
The research and attention to detail is just beyond. What happened is David saw a passage in Berniece Miracle's book, My Sister Marilyn, where there was just one line where Marilyn's mother, Gladys, clarified the origin and the history of where she came up with the name Norma Jeane. And so David took that and picked it up and ran with it and started to do more research on it. And that's the focus of our podcast today. Are we ready?
We are ready.
All right, let's do it.
If I am a star, the people made me a star.
Marilyn Monroe.
Like the stage here and now, fame is fickle.
Marilyn Monroe.
I give you the two most exciting words in the modern dictionary. Marilyn Monroe!
David Stenn, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm great, and I'm thrilled to be here.
This is a thrill for me. I've been a fan of your work for a long time. I watched Boardwalk Empire. I loved the work you did for Girl 27 and the article you wrote for Vanity Fair. This is exciting for me.
Thanks for having me. Like I said, I'm thrilled to be here. I love your podcast.
Thank you for coming.
As we mentioned in the intro, you took one line from Berniece Miracle's book and really dove into the history of how Gladys, Marilyn's mother, came up with the name Norma Jeane. So there's a commonly repeated story that Norma Jeane was named after two film stars, Norma Talmage and Jean Harlow. Even before we knew the origin of Norma Jeane's name, how do we know that this story isn't true, David? How do we know that she actually wasn't named after these two stars?
We know it from the best possible source, which is the woman who named her, her mother, Gladys. She told her other daughter, Berniece Baker Miracle, who then put it in her book. And that's how I discovered it originally, because I read My Sister Marilyn, which I recommend for people to read, which was written by Berniece and her daughter, Mona, both of whom knew Marilyn Monroe, knew her when she was still Norma Jeane. And it was a casual one-line sentence in the book, which later in life, after Marilyn Monroe had died, Gladys Baker told her daughter, I never named her for Norma Talmage. I named her for Norma Jeane Cohen, whose family I worked for in Louisville. And that was the entire sentence. It jumped out at me because I thought, what? Who is Norma Jeane Cohen? And how did this happen? And of course, did Norma Jeane Cohen ever know that Marilyn Monroe was her namesake?
And that led you to jump down the rabbit hole.
Her book said that Norma Jeane Cohen lived in Louisville. So I had an approximate age and I had a city. But of course, women marry sometimes more than once. And so I just got lucky. This was pre-internet, so you couldn't just go online and look for clips. And I just got lucky and I found her, and I will remember that call for the rest of my life, because I reached out to her and I said, hello, I want to tell you why I'm calling. Do you know who was named after you? And she didn't know what I was talking about. And I said, Marilyn Monroe. She, again, didn't understand because she didn't get the Norma Jeane part. And then I explained the whole situation to her, and she was too young to remember Gladys Baker, who worked for the family, and didn't realize all of the problems and trouble and grief and heartache and tragedy that Gladys Baker, who at that time would have been 21, 22, had already experienced in her life. But she did know about her own mother, and she loved her mother. And she said, if there was anyone that would have been good to somebody, it was my mother. I can understand why Gladys might have loved her and might have loved me. I was a little girl. I was cute.
Let's start from the beginning, just in case someone might not know the story. Norma Jeane's mother, Gladys, or Marilyn's mother, Gladys, was married to her first husband, Jasper Baker, when she was a teenager. She was actually pregnant with her first baby, and she was 14 years old. When she married Jasper, they lied on the marriage certificate and said she was 15 so she could get married. It was not a happy marriage. They had 2 kids. Gladys later said that Jasper had been physically abusive, so they split up. We have to take Gladys's word on the abuse, but what we know for certain is that Jasper kidnapped their 2 kids and went back to his home state of Kentucky. Gladys followed and then stayed in Kentucky for a while. And that's where your story picks up. Did we know how long she stayed? Did we know how she found the Cohen family? And if you could fill us in on all of that.
She did marry Gladys Baker just when she was 14, and her mother signed the marriage record attesting to her incorrect age. So technically her mother broke the law in order to make this happen. We don't know how she got pregnant. Was this consensual or not? We don't know. If a woman back then in 1917, if something happened to her, you'd marry the man. From the start, it was troubled. And we do know, and there's legal evidence of his abuse. Gladys obtained a restraining order against him. So there was always a problem. And she tried to retrieve her children in Kentucky. So a teenage girl went to Kentucky. She was a girl. She was underage. She went to Kentucky to get her children back. And she was told, you can't have them back. And the court would not side with her.
So this really frustrates me.
It's terrible. She had nobody advocating for her. And these were her son and her daughter. And a man taking care of 2 young children. He wasn't really capable of that. And she had heard through some of his relatives that the son, Jackie, had rickets, which is a vitamin C deficiency. So she was desperate to get her children back. And she went to Kentucky and she couldn't, but she wouldn't leave. But she had no money. So she found the only job she could, which was working as a domestic for a local family, the Cohens, Harry and Lena Cohen. And they had 2 young daughters, one of whom was a little baby herself. She had just been born. And to answer your question about how long she was there, we don't know exactly, but we can figure it out deductively because we have a letter that I found dated January 15th, 1922, where Jasper is already in Flatlick, Kentucky. And we know Gladys would then marry Mortensen in October of 24. So mid-late 1922 and all of 1923, where I found her listed in the Louisville City Directory, she's there. The only reason she's there is to try and make enough money to get her children back. And she finally gives up because it's not going to happen. And she goes back to California. But apparently she told Lena Cohen, who had been very good to her, if I ever have a daughter, I'm going to name her after your baby. And her baby's name was Norma Jeane Cohen. So when Gladys did have her daughter, she named her Norma Jeane, just like she had told Mrs. Cohen she would.
Do you think that if she had had more money, she would have gotten her kids back? Or do you think it was a time and a place where the court system sided with the man? Also, a lot of people over the years have doubted Gladys's word over and over again. She says the father of Norma Jeane was Stan Gifford, which we'll get into in a minute, and no one believed her. And it turned out to be true. And then here we have another instance of Gladys was someone who kept her word, and people have not really trusted Gladys as a person.
I think there's been a lot of prejudice against Gladys historically, and the stigma of mental illness. There was a lot of mental illness in the family, as you know. Gladys's mother ended up being institutionalized. But I think Gladys was trying. Gladys was pursuing her children. And to answer your question about whether she would have prevailed, it's impossible to know for sure. But the courts did tend to favor a mother for
Right.
custodial reasons. They would favor the mother. However, the Baker clan, they lived in Kentucky and they knew people. So
Right.
in order to have any kind of influence or power, Gladys would have needed the money to find a lawyer and pay a lawyer. And that might have made a difference. We'll
Yeah.
never know, but she couldn't, so she didn't. And she had no way to get those kids back. And she tried. There's a surviving letter from Jasper to Gladys saying, you can have your kids back if you come back to me. So Gladys had this choice. And I think to answer Elisa, your earlier point about we don't know the nature or the extent or even the veracity of the abuse,
Mhm.
I believe there was abuse, because if there wasn't, she would have gone back to him.
There is a story that he beat her with a horse and buggy whip or something like that.
Yeah, she told that later. Remember, Jasper was 16 years older than Gladys.
Right.
So what is a 30-year-old doing with a 14-year-old?
Right.
Yeah, today that's called statutory rape.
That's exactly right, Scott. Even back then, it was statutory rape, which is why Gladys's mother had to lie on the marriage certificate. We'll never know for sure because we weren't
Right.
there. But based on the surviving court records, which I found, and just what we know about, like you said, Elisa, the social mores back then, women had no power. And here is a teenage girl who has 2 children, and she just wants to get them back and protect them. And she must have cared about those kids because she went all the way to Kentucky by herself where she knew no one.
Right.
It's such an amazing story because everybody has this image of Gladys. She just wasn't capable of mothering. She had mental problems. She was institutionalized. Poor Marilyn. But yet her children, prior to Marilyn even being born, as a child herself, she was going out of her way to try to get custody of her children and be able to raise them on her own.
Yes. And even when Marilyn, Norma Jeane, was an infant and the Bolanders tried to adopt her, Gladys wouldn't allow it. Gladys wanted to be a parent. And like I said before, there was mental illness in the family. So you could say, well, now we're finding out about possible genetic components. We don't know. But you could also read this story as someone who was driven crazy by the mistreatment she received over and over and over again.
You know, there is research now saying that a lot of times mental illness can be a combination of both genetics and circumstances.
I think it's heroic and incredibly daring in 1922 for a teenage girl to go to another state in another region that she's never been to and doesn't know anyone, just to find and claim and protect her children. And she's willing to get a job to stay there alone in order to do that. And she doesn't leave until she decides there's no way this is going to work. And we
Right.
all know what happened to Jackie. He eventually died as a young boy.
Mhm.
So she was not wrong. And imagine that heartbreak and the guilt that she may have felt about what could I have done? What should I have done that I didn't do to get him back? Because she was right. He wasn't safe.
Right.
That's just a lot to handle for someone at that age and throughout the rest of her life.
Yes. And also, sometimes I think about the degree of Marilyn Monroe's sensitivity, what made her such a great actor, but also what made her such a kind and empathetic and caring person. There are innumerable stories about that, how understanding she was, how much she loved children, how much she loved animals, how much she saw. Arthur Miller talked about it all the time, how much she helped Joe DiMaggio. She got him into therapy. Where did that come from? I think part of it must have come from her mother.
Right. We know Gladys comes back to Los Angeles and she tries to get on with her life. She gets a job at Consolidated Films as a film cutter, which is the lowest rung of the entertainment industry at the time. It's low paying, usually women working in that kind of position. And she starts dating one of her supervisors, Stan Gifford. We know that she learns she's pregnant, probably late 1925. He makes it clear he's not going to be present for this child. So then we get into Marilyn's name in general. Gladys at this point had remarried a man by the name of Edward Mortensen, but it was an unhappy marriage. It quickly fell apart. And when she got pregnant by Gifford, she was separated from Mr. Mortensen, but still legally married. So she puts Mortensen's name on her baby's birth certificate. and she names her baby Norma Jeane after Norma Jean Cohen, we now know. So it says a couple of things. One, she kept her word about naming her baby Norma Jean. And two, this is 1926 when she's born. Why would Gladys put another man's name on her baby's birth certificate if he was not the father?
She would put Mortenson's name on the marriage record because she was still legally married to him. The idea of a married woman putting another man's name on the birth certificate of her child would have been scandalous. And Stan Gifford had just gone through a really bitter divorce. And the accusations of his ex-wife, when I found those records, they're pretty vicious. Whether they're true or not, who knows, because divorces can be ugly, as this one was. But what if she had put Stan Gifford's name and he had said, I don't know what you're talking about? It was way too risky. And it was also someone she worked not with, but for. Like you said, he was her supervisor. And that begs another question. When you're working today, that would be harassment.
Right.
Whether or not it was a romance or whether she felt pressured into it or whether it was a little bit of both, it was inappropriate and it put a lot of pressure on Gladys.
So do you think that putting another man's name on her baby's birth certificate was what most women would have done?
No married woman would have put another man's name on the
Okay.
birth certificate ever, because it would have invited a host of questions right from the hospital saying, what do you
Right.
mean your husband is this person? Are you saying that he's not the father of the child? And then the child becomes a bastard.
Right. Which was a terrible thing to be called back then.
Terrible thing to be called. And it also indicated that the mother was a woman of loose morals. And in California, they had something called the insanity complaint, which if anyone felt you were insane, they could go to court and file an insanity complaint against you. And you could be deemed insane by the court and sent to an institution. And that law was not abolished until 1967 in
Oh
the
my
state of
goodness.
California. So I've seen cases where someone's plumber, at the behest of her estranged husband, files an insanity complaint. And there's a hearing, and the person is not allowed to defend themselves. They're allowed to attend, they're allowed to listen, but they're not allowed to take any action. And the idea of doing that when you have a baby, again, here is Gladys with another child. It's a second chance. She's lost her first two children. I don't think she would risk anything to lose this one. It was the idea that she would have registered at the hospital as Gladys Baker Mortensen. So the baby becomes Norma Jeane Mortensen. They married in October of 1924, and Gladys walked out a couple of months later, and she filed for divorce in May of 1925. So in California at the time, you had a year between the time your divorce was granted and the time it was final. Norma Jeane was born right at the deadline.
Just an interesting side note that Norma Jeane in Kentucky and Norma Jeane in California do have a slightly different spelling. For whatever reason, Gladys ended Norma Jeane's name with an E, Norma Jeane with an E. Interestingly, I've always found this a fun coincidence. Gladys's other daughter, Berniece, has an extra E from the typical spelling of Bernice. I've always been fascinated by that.
I agree. I feel the same way. And to me, it's again the sign of Gladys's youth. She was a teenager when Bernice was born. She had just turned 24 when Norma Jeane was born. So this is a young woman. She was young. She was fanciful. There's something sweet about that.
I just wanted to circle back to the Cohen family. Tell us how Gladys discovered the opportunity to work for the Cohen family.
It's a funny story. I found this newspaper clipping where the Cohens had servants who were misbehaving. They would go out of town and the servants would get into their liquor cabinet, which is additionally funny because it was during Prohibition. But they would get into their liquor cabinet and they would have parties. So they were having servant problems, and they were so problematic, apparently, that it was covered in the local newspapers. So they were looking for good help, and Gladys showed up, and apparently she must have been good help because they loved her and she loved them. And she stayed there and worked for them and took care of their baby, which shows how much they trusted her.
What do we know about the Cohen family just in general? Clearly, it sounds like they were a family with money and resources.
They weren't rich, but they were very comfortable. They lived in a beautiful area of Louisville. They were a traditional, close Jewish family.
It sounds like they were very loving.
According to Norma Jeane Cohen, they were very loving. And her mother was a really special person. I think Gladys must have experienced a family situation she was unfamiliar with because Gladys's own home life had been fractured and difficult. She had a brother who had disappeared. She had a mother with mental issues who had been married multiple times. So to see this traditional Southern Jewish tight-knit family probably made a huge impact on her and showed her a way of living and a way of being that she wasn't familiar with. Remember, she'd just come out of this abusive marriage and had her children stolen.
Do you think that was part of why she named her daughter Norma Jeane? There was a real affinity for this family?
I think we'll never know for sure, but I would speculate that every time she would say the word Norma Jeane, she'd be reminded of Norma Jean Cohen and the Cohen family and how she'd been treated with love and care and nurturing. She was an employee, but she was treated like family. According to what Norma Jean Cohen told me, that's how her mother treated people. Norma Jean's mother had been dead for decades by the time I spoke to her, and she still remembered her with such love. And she said, it wasn't just me, everybody felt that way about her.
Is Norma Jeane Cohen still around, or has she passed?
No, she passed away. I think she was 96, but she was a remarkable person, and she had a very close family. She had 2 daughters and she had grandchildren, and they were all very close. And when I got in touch with them, they were just so proud of her, and you could see all that love. Again, it reminds you of how different Marilyn Monroe's life would have been if she had just had some sort of stability. Parental stability and faith. If she had just grown up in some sort of home where there was a support network, it would have made such a difference.
So that begs the question that just popped into my mind. Marilyn was very smart strategically. And of course, the character Marilyn Monroe was exactly that, a character. It was an image or an alter ego that she created and she turned into. Ultimately, I think couldn't escape. But she figured out a way to set herself apart, and she became very committed to being a movie star, to being famous, to living that life. Do you think, in your opinion, if she'd had a different life growing up, or she had a better support system, more stability, might that somehow have impacted her drive?
Personally, I consider her a genius. It's not a word that was used for women back then, but that doesn't mean there weren't plenty of female geniuses, and she was one of them. She was born with a gift. When you have that kind of talent and that kind of drive and that kind of need that she had, and you have that gift, I think you're unstoppable. And I consider her unstoppable because if you think of all the obstacles she faced and overcame on her own, it's incredible. And I think that's partially what accounts for why people still care about her so much. She's so admirable. I also think that if she'd had more structure and more protection, she could have survived and thrived and not been so exploited and taken advantage of and felt unappreciated. All those heartbreaking stories, for example, her telling Susan Strasberg when Susan Strasberg said, "Oh, I wish I were you." And Marilyn Monroe said, nobody, you don't want to be me. Because Marilyn Monroe wanted to be taken seriously, which is a human basic need. When you're an artist and you're expressing yourself, you want to be treated like an artist. You want that respect. You constantly hear people like Madonna referring to themselves as artists. It's an important identity. And Marilyn Monroe was diminished and dismissed and never taken seriously in a way that she deserved. Now she is. But if you read the way people wrote about her or talked about her back then, she never won an Academy Award. How is that possible? So I think if she'd grown up, to answer your question, Scott, I think if she'd grown up in a more traditional, loving, nurturing environment, she would have had more confidence and she wouldn't have needed to recreate a family, because one thing when you read her life story, she's constantly trying to recreate a family dynamic that she never had, whether that's with the Chekhovs or the Strasbergs or the Millers or the DiMaggios. She wants a family.
The Rostons. I think it's even beyond what people said or wrote about her. You can actually see it in the way that members of the press would interview her. Wasn't there an interview one time where Marilyn made a statement and somebody actually said, "Well, can you spell that?" And Marilyn turned around and said, "Can you?" You know, I mean, it's just that kind of thing.
And when she was reading War and Peace and people mock her and say, "You're not really reading that book." I think it was very common back then as well to do to women in general. The song Zip that Rodgers and Hart wrote for the musical Pal Joey, when they reshot it in 1957 with Frank Sinatra and Rita Hayworth, they changed the lyric for Rita Hayworth's song Zip. Marilyn Monroe looks dandy and mink. She not only acts, I hear she can think. And it's that, oh, ha ha, isn't that funny? Maybe she can think. And by that point, 1957, she's already shown this comedic gift that still thrills and delights people.
For sure. She's won in the end, in a way. I can attest to the fact that she actually did read the books. I own several books from her library, and several of them are on psychology, and she underlined passages and made notes. And she definitely read the books. It's not just something she was carrying around as a prop.
Back to your question, I feel like if she'd had a different background, she might have had clearly more of an education, which was a source of deep insecurity for her. And she loved education. She loved to learn. She loved to read. In all of those qualities that people now recognize, but back then they mocked and dismissed.
You know, another layer of this, which Elisa pointed out in our last podcast where we interviewed Holly Madison, Elisa shared a story about when she was in school having to pick a celebrity to write about, and her teacher put this on a timeline, this great big timeline. And other people that were super famous also that lived really long lives had really long timelines. And Marilyn just had this little tiny blip for her short 36 years. But the impact is significant.
That's so true. And when you think about stars, I'm always interested in 2025, which stars from the golden age are remembered and which are less remembered. And she is a constant. There has been no diminution and then an ascendance. She has been pretty much ever since she passed away. She has been a constant, and it just doesn't end. And I don't think it ever will, because the work backs it up.
Right.
You never hear anyone say, I saw a Marilyn Monroe movie, I don't get her.
Right. Yeah,
You don't.
True.
You never do. And I don't think you ever will, because like you said, Scott, she's her own creation. And that's her work of art. Her work of art is herself. And doing that in the 1950s, which was probably the most repressive decade of the 20th century, to turn yourself into your own work of art, it's like performance art. It's genius.
I wanted to dive into Norma Jeane in Kentucky. You made contact with her. What was her response when she found out that she was Marilyn Monroe's namesake in a way?
Well, imagine if you're someone in your late 80s and you get a call from a stranger who says to you, hello, Marilyn Monroe is named after you. It knocked her sideways. She was baffled at first and she didn't understand. And then I explained it. And like I said before, she wasn't familiar with Gladys. She was too young to remember Gladys. So I explained, and she was thrilled and delighted and honored.
Oh.
And I think it also really was meaningful to her personally because it reminded her of her own mother and father and what wonderful people they were and how much she loved them, because it was a new instance, decades after both of them had died, of how they impacted a person she didn't even remember so strongly that she chose to name her own child after one of their children. So she was thrilled. And of course, her family was astounded. This was a big deal.
It's an amazing discovery. What are the chances?
That's right. And I got so tired of reading about she was named after Norma Talmage and Jean Harlow, because in 1926, Jean Harlow was a 15-year-old high school student.
You know, there's something to be said for really looking at the dates, isn't there? A question, David, that I had, how old was Norma Jean Cohen when she got the information?
Norma Jean Cohen would have been in her late 80s, I believe.
Okay.
So she knew this for a few years before she left us.
Yeah, she had not known. It's the strangest. Who would ever think, well, my name's Norma Jean and Marilyn Monroe's name is Norma Jean, so she must be named after me. I was born in Kentucky and she was born in Hollywood, but hey.
Right. It all adds up.
It sounds like she grew up to have a happy life.
She did. She had a wonderful life, and it's so poignant because she had, like I said, these wonderful parents that she adored, and then she had two daughters that she adored, and then she had grandchildren that she adored. So it was so different. And that's the poignance. You're thinking Gladys having a baby and trying to bring in the Cohens in a way by naming her baby after one of their babies, because she'd seen a happy family.
It's almost like two parallel universes.
Right.
Yes, and I'm so glad that I discovered it while Norma Jean Cohen was still alive, because it was such a blessing to tell her. And I don't believe Marilyn Monroe ever knew.
No, I don't think she would have known. She never said anything about it.
And Bernice didn't know until years after Marilyn Monroe died.
And again, it was something Gladys just mentioned in passing.
That's right. She didn't even mention it in passing. I believe it's in the book, but I believe Bernice said, wasn't she named after? And Gladys said, no, she wasn't. She was named after Norma Jean Cohen in Louisville. And Bernice was like, huh?
I think this story adds a lot of depth to Gladys's character and what we know about her.
I agree. Gladys is a fascinating person who deserves a book of her own. The journey of a woman in that era under those conditions. And then I always like to say she gave birth to both a star and a miracle.
Oh, that's very clever.
We may use that. We'll credit you. So, David, you just released a video on YouTube about this story. Say a little bit more about that.
I do a series on Turner Classic Movies called Untold Hollywood, and they're just stories that I have researched or found along the way, because I'm always working on several different things, and I'm always researching several different things, and sometimes they're just brick walls, but sometimes, as in this case, they're really not. And so they're little 3 to 4 minute interstitials that TCM runs frequently between the films, but you can also find them on my YouTube channel. And this particular segment is called Naming Norma Jean. And it's the full segment on how this all happened, with some great photographs and evidence, documents that people had not seen. And it really just tells the story in less than 4 minutes about how this all happened and who it happened to.
And your YouTube channel is at David Stenn?
Yes, David Stenn YouTube channel. You'll get there.
And side note, something that I found really fascinating and intriguing, and I recognized immediately where you are when you're filming some of these videos for your YouTube channel. You're at a pretty famous location.
I am at an amazing location, and it is called the Beverly Estate, and it was the home of William Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies after they left San Simeon due to Hearst's decline in his health. And he actually passed away at this home. And then the year later, Marion Davies loaned it to 2 young newlyweds who were passing through, named John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. And they spent part of their honeymoon there. And then the estate became a really popular location of so many classic Hollywood films. If you've seen The Godfather, the Horse's Head scene was shot there. If you've seen Harper with Paul Newman, it was shot there. If you've seen The Way We Were with Barbra Streisand and Robert Redford, shot there. The Bodyguard with Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston. Black is King, the Beyonce video. So it's been this fantastic location. So shooting a show about Hollywood history at such a historic location
is a thrill, I'll bet.
A huge thrill. And what's also a thrill is the current owner is restoring it to its former glory.
Oh, you mean they're not gutting it or tearing it down?
Quite the opposite, I am thrilled to say.
I recognized it from The Bodyguard. And I'm a huge Whitney fan. Whitney's music was the soundtrack of my life. Devastated when she died. She's somebody else that I collect. I own some Whitney Houston clothing pieces that she actually wore in one of her concerts that I attended. So it was amazing to acquire some pieces from a tour that she did that I actually saw.
Oh, wow.
So I have that in my collection now. I was like, wait a minute, that looks like the Bodyguard house. And, you know, you and I talked about that. And I'm like, holy crap. So it was really kind of cool. And of course, it's got a history well beyond and going way back.
And there was a party that Luella Parsons called the last great Hollywood party in 1951 that Marion Davies threw to welcome Johnny Ray, the singer, to Hollywood. And there's a lot of photos of that party on the episode because everybody was there. And you just see Judy Garland and Lana Turner gossiping at a table together. And Clark Gable, I mean, just everyone was there. I think the guest list surpassed 1,000 people.
Wow.
Oh my God.
That's amazing. David, thank you again for taking the time to share this incredible story. You found a snippet in a book about Marilyn, and then you picked it up and you dove in deep and you really got some incredible details. Anybody wanting to learn more about it or see David's clip can just look for his channel on YouTube. What's the title of the series again, David?
The title of the series on TCM is Untold Hollywood, and the specific segment is called Naming Norma Jeane.
How can people follow you online on some of your other social media if they want to keep up with Mr. Stenn?
I am on Instagram at Real David Stenn, and I am continually and constantly posting things I feel people have never seen or heard. I always try and find new content that is what I'm looking for. And a lot of it is what I've collected in the course of my career. And it's really rewarding to see the reaction to it because I never thought anyone was that interested. That sounds naive, but I did. And so when I post this now and people get excited, it makes me very happy.
This was a really fun topic. Thank you for introducing another layer into the study of Marilyn Monroe.
Well, thank you both for continuing to make her flame burn bright.
Thanks, David.
Thanks again, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have any feedback or just want to say hello, please feel free to email us at allthingsmarilynpodcast@gmail.com, or you can find us on Instagram at allthingsmarilynpodcast. And if you like this podcast, the kindest thing you can do is to like and subscribe, give us a review, or you can just tell a friend to listen. The more we get out information about Marilyn, the better.
We'll see you next time on All Things Marilyn.
Good night, man.
Bye-bye.
You loved on the screen, and that's the one thing that survived,
I realize more and more the responsibility, but you do miss sometimes just being able to be completely yourself and someplace and people just know you as another human being.